Until about 300 years ago, we assumed that the Earth was at the center of our solar system and that everything else, including the Sun, revolved around it. This was called geocentrism. And the notion that brought about geocentrism was that for people on Earth, everything seemed to fall towards it. So the natural assumption was that the Earth was at the center of our universe, because gravity had not been discovered yet. This was reinforced by the Holy Scripture at the time because medieval Europeans tended to interpret the Bible quite literally. This is what the geocentric model looked like. This is what the geocentric model looked like, and it's hard to tell from this photo because there's so much going on, but you'll notice that this only goes up to Saturn because that's all they could see with their bare eyes. And I think, personally, that this looks pretty beautiful, considering medieval astronomers had to stand outside every single night and look at the sky for years, for decades, charting the motion of what looked to them to be distant lights with nothing more than their bare eyes, and the belief that the universe could be understood. Now, over time, some astronomers started to become uneasy with the growing complexities of this model. There were just too many inconsistencies, and it started to feel like this model was being patched together to preserve the assumption that it was the Earth that stood still at the center. It's like trying to argue that they parked the car somewhere first, and then they tried to build the mall around that, which is how it works. Of course, as we all know, you're crazy, I'm not crazy, Among the most striking of these inconsistencies was retrograde motion. Under the geocentric model, there was no explanation as to why planets suddenly started moving the opposite direction, and to justify this, they had to start creating more elaborate mathematical gymnastics. Now, all of these loops you're seeing here is what retrograde motion is, and that whole Mercury being in retrograde thing that a certain demographic of people use to justify being weird, this is where all that comes from. Now, this is where the GOAT, the Polish astronomer Nicolas Copernicus comes in. He starts to wonder whether the problem isn't with the observations that we're making, but at the assumption that lies at the center. And he's like, yo, this looks like something, verbatim, mind you, he says this verbatim, yo, this looks like something that we would see if the sun was at the center of the solar system and it were the planets and everything else that revolved around the sun. Under his heliocentric model, retrograde motion was explained as a mere optical illusion. Now, allow me to explain using a bag of M&Ms. You see, Earth has a faster orbit than an outer planet like Mars. Now, the principle behind retrograde motion is pretty easy. It's the same thing that you would see if you were on a highway and you overtake a slower car. What it's going to look like when you overtake that slower car is that that car is moving backwards, when in reality that is not the case. It is just a matter of perspective. Now, suddenly we have gone from this to this. Copernicus himself mentions, who in this most beautiful temple would place this lamp in another or better position than from which it can illuminate the whole at once. Problem solved, we can all go home, we can call it a day, and not kill each other. Maybe, we're all friends here, right? Take a wild guess. The problem with this was that if the Earth moves, then suddenly humanity does not sit at the center of creation. We're not special anymore. We can't be God's chosen people if we're not at the center. Now, if you want to get pedantic about it, technically, the planets don't orbit the sun perfectly either. Let me show you. So the way this works is that both celestial bodies orbit a single point, which is a shared center of mass outside both of them. And this is what they orbit instead of everything orbiting the sun, because everything with mass exerts a gravitational pull on everything else. So Jupiter would have the most proclivity to pull the sun towards itself because it's so massive compared to the other planets. Now, to find out exactly how far the barycenter is from the center of the sun, we're going to do some math. The equation to find out the barycenter, RB, is the mass of Jupiter divided by the mass of the sun, plus the mass of Jupiter again, multiplied by the distance of separation between the center of the sun and the center of Jupiter. I have all these values written out over here, and when you run the math, you get an answer of 742,700 kilometers of distance from the center of the sun. Now, what that's going to look like is Let's say this is the sun, this filled-in circle, and the barycenter is this small distance away from the surface of the sun. And that distance roughly comes out to be 46,360 kilometers. So how this is going to manifest visually is that you'll see the sun wobble slightly in the night sky because it is making this entire orbit around this barycenter instead of just rotating around its axis. What fascinates me more than the mathematics of all of this is the unrelenting pursuit these people had. 15 centuries before Copernicus wrote this book, there was this dude named Aristarchus, and he suggested first that the sun sat at the center of the universe, but because he lacked the observational tools and the mathematical framework needed to prove this, his idea faded into obscurity. Obscurity. It was a few decades after Copernicus wrote this book where Kepler proved that it was not circles but ellipses that all these planets orbited in. And then in 1616, Galileo Galilei used his telescope to finally prove and give us evidence of the Copernican model using the phases of Venus and the fact that moons orbited Jupiter. At the time, heliocentrism was viewed by many as a threat to established doctrine, and the Roman Inquisition formally declared it foolish and absurd in philosophy and heretical, and Galileo was ordered not to teach this as the physical reality. A few years later, Pope Urban VIII granted permission to Galileo to talk about heliocentrism as a hypothesis only, but Galileo published his work Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, defending the Copernican model. They got him. In 1633, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition, and he was found suspect to heresy. He was made to publicly recant, his books were banned, and he spent the remainder of his life on house arrest. In 1992, more than 3 centuries later, Pope John Paul II formally recognized that the Church erred in their treatment of Galileo and recognized the failure to distinguish between biblical interpretation and scientific evidence. Galileo could have chosen a quieter life. He could have remained silent. But instead, he chose to defend what he believed to be true, not because he owed the world anything, but because he understood some questions are too important to abandon. The truth can be obscured. The truth can be buried underneath authority, but sooner or later the truth always prevails. When I think about these visionary people that came before us, people who made it their life's mission to pursue the truth, even when it felt like convincing the rest of the world was like trying to move the world with your bare hands, with the weight of the entire world's doubt pressing against you, it's because of these very people that we were able to find our place in an incomprehensibly vast universe. We are infinitesimally small compared to the size of the cosmos. The time we've existed is negligible compared to the age of existence itself. Yet I believe that the only thing more audacious than the infinite nature of the universe is us, our will to understand all of it, where we are, how we are, why we are, whatever our motivations are, whether it's faith, whether it's the prestige, whether it's curiosity. In a universe this endless, we are all we have. So tell me, how do you define freedom? Perhaps it is the ability to ask that very question. And as small as we stood beneath the heavens, and as insignificant as we were told we were, just remember that it was us that moved the earth.